So that's how the book of Exodus begins, with the Israelites enslaved building granaries for Pharaoh in Egypt. And I think that's where the story begins in a lot of our minds, but it's easy to forget that the Israelites were not slaves when they first came to Egypt. The book of Genesis ends with the story of Joseph. Joseph, who was sold by his brothers to the Egyptians when he was a child, but he quickly rose to some prominence in Pharaoh's court. He was a trusted advisor, renowned for his ability to interpret dreams. Joseph, the first Israelite in Egypt, correctly predicted a great famine that would befall Egypt. And because of his warning, the people were prepared and they survived. And Joseph was well regarded and well rewarded for this. The first Israelite in Egypt became wealthy. He had many flocks. He had overflowing, impressive bags of gold. And he sent for his entire family, and they came, and when they arrived, they were given land, they were honored. The book of Genesis ends on this hopeful note. Joseph lives to a ripe old age. He holds even his great-grandchildren on his knee before he dies peacefully and is buried in a tomb in Egypt, where his family is doing well, enjoying a good life with a grateful people. That's how the book of Genesis ends. And the book of Exodus, which follows right afterward, picks up with this ominous beginning. There arose a king in Egypt who did not know Joseph. Several generations have passed, and Joseph forgotten. And things get bad quickly. This new king says to his subjects, "Look, the Israelites are more numerous and more powerful than we are. We better be smart about this, or they're going to increase in number, and in the event of war, they will join our enemies, they will fight against us, they will escape from the land." And so the Israelites are enslaved, not so much because of a need for labor, but because the king was afraid that those foreigners might soon outnumber the Egyptians, afraid that such a situation might threaten the power that he had grown accustomed to. The king is afraid, and so he enslaves a whole group of people, works them nearly to death, lest they have any free time to imagine the future, any free time or energy to grow in number or to plot anything against him. The Israelites are impressed, enslaved, worked to the brink, and meanwhile, Pharaoh is talking to the Egyptians. "These people are not like us," he says in a later verse. And his animosity and hatred gets so ramped up so quickly that pretty soon you could be forgiven for forgetting that the Israelites had ever been anything but slaves. It would be easy to forget where it all began. There arose a king in Egypt who did not know Joseph. It all began because of something that the king forgot, something that everyone once knew. He forgot that the Israelites were descendants of a man who had once saved his people. He forgot that there was a man named Joseph who was once counted as a member of the royal court and part of Pharaoh's own family. He forgot all that history, all that nuance, but at a very basic level, at the most basic level, what he really forgot, he forgot that the Israelites were people like him. He forgot that they were human. One of my favorite biblical commentators is a woman named Aviva Zornberg, who has written a beautiful book about Exodus called The Particulars of Rapture. And she, in her commentary, notes that when Pharaoh describes the Egyptians, he always uses verbs that are typically used to describe insects. He describes them as swarming, teeming, nameless, faceless. There arose a king in Egypt who did not know Joseph. And so it all begins, not because of the king's ideas or the things he knows. It begins because of what Pharaoh forgets. The truth is that we humans, every one of us, are hardwired from birth for connection, for community, for love. None of us were born with a scrap of hatred in our hearts. And yet that part of us that is intent on love and connection, although it might be the most original feature of our souls, it is also the most vulnerable part of who we are in the face of a frightening and violent world. The fact of our shared humanity with all others is a truth, it's an instinct that each one of us has, but it's so easy to forget, so easy to lose. It slips through our fingers when we face fear or scarcity or suspicion. The loving part of our hearts and our spirits is so easy to forget. But it's the most original part of who we are. Everything else, all bigotry and hatred and racism, it's learned. We pick it up from somewhere else as we go along, and it's usually in ways that are much more subtle than overt. Nobody sits anyone down and teaches them hatred. But we live and move in a culture where we can almost breathe in prejudice from the air around us in small signals, and it has a tendency to pull us and shape us little by little away from the truth. And it's easy to forget where it all began. But the truth is that nobody, no ruler, no terrorist, no white supremacist, nobody can cultivate hatred in their hearts until they forget something basic. Hatred cannot take root and grow in a human heart until we forget that everyone is a person like us. No system of oppression can be built, no community can be enslaved, no angry bile can be spewed until the simple truth of our shared humanity is forgotten, until the truth of our shared history and our shared destiny is laid aside. And unfortunately, we live in a world, as the Israelites did before us, and as every generation in between did, where the simple truth of our shared humanity is so easily forgotten, with terrifying and violent consequences. We live in a world like the Israelites did before us, where the truth of our shared humanity can be drowned in anxiety and fear. This is the part of the sermon where I'm supposed to say, here's the good news. Here's the good news. It didn't work. Not in the long run. The story continues, the last verse that Steve read this morning. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. And of course, we know that the Israelites were not slaves much longer. God led them out through the waters of the sea to freedom. We know that even though powerful people forgot their humanity, God never forgot. God never saw them as anything other than God's own people. Their cries rose to heaven, and God set the path to their freedom before them. So to walk through this world as people of faith is to walk through it with confidence that the world is in God's hands, that the God who we worship here is a God who has never tolerated oppression indefinitely, a God whose heart is inclined toward freedom and flourishing. And you and I are created in God's image. And I believe that we are wired that way too, that our hearts are inclined toward freedom. It's the way we are made. We're inclined toward love. I believe that deep down, every person on this planet has an innate memory of our shared destiny and our shared humanity. Every one of us was made with that divine impulse etched in our soul to see the other as our kin, no matter who they are, no matter how many times we have been told otherwise. We come from one another. We share a destiny together. We belong to one another, and we are responsible for one another. And every human heart is born knowing that. The problem is just that somewhere along the way, something persuades us that that's not true. Somewhere along the line, we forget. But we could. All of us could. Any one of us could. Every person could. Reach back. Reach deep. And remember.